weekly baking show in my kitchen. I am Bryan, and welcome to my kitchen. We are baking live today. I'm going to give it a few minutes so that we can, in case anybody is waiting to come on and see me. Today we're going to be making something really simple but really good. Chocolate fudge brownies. So we're gonna do them one way, but I'm gonna talk about a lot of different ways that you can do brownies, because brownies are a super versatile thing to make. You can add a lot of ingredients to them to make them different flavors. They're very customizable. So yeah, I mean, it's a basic recipe. I'm thinking that I'm gonna start doing a few videos in this series of like basics, like baking basics. So like basic recipes, brownies, cookies, blondies, muffins, that sort of thing. So this will be the first in that basic series that we do, the chocolate fudge brownies. Pretty much, it's not very many ingredients really if you look at it. If you've pulled up the ingredient list or the recipe in front of you, if you're baking along with us, great. Welcome, and thank you for baking along with us. Thank you for watching. Basic recipes: chocolate, butter, sugar, vanilla, coffee, instant coffee powder, which we'll get to when I add that ingredient too, why we use it, what the purpose of it is. And then this recipe has walnuts in it. They're optional. Some people don't like walnuts, some people like nuts. You can sub out any nut that you like. You could use macadamias, pecans, you can even use peanuts. Walnuts are pretty much the most versatile and most well-known nut in a brownie. So it looks like we have a couple more viewers, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with our recipe. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to melt our butter in a pot. I'm using a very heavy bottom saucepan to do it in. It's a good idea to use a heavy bottom saucepan because it evenly distributes the heat. This one actually has a copper core in it too. It evenly distributes the heat and doesn't allow too much raw heat to get to the bottom of the pot and burn the product, which would be bad since we're putting chocolate in here. So the recipe calls for a pound of butter, which may seem like a lot, but remember that this recipe makes at least 20 brownies. So when you break it down, it's not really that much butter per brownie, but it may seem like a lot to start out with. Something else I wanted to touch on before I start this this recipe: it's always good to have either a trash can right next to you or some kind of trash receptacle or bin on your countertop, on your cooktop when you're working. I do it at work. I do it here when I'm cooking. Just something so that you don't have to go searching for a trash can, because like if you're doing eggs and you have the drippiness from the eggs, from the eggshells, you just want to real quick be able to throw it into the trash can and not have to search around the kitchen to find something to throw it in. So I always keep a trash receptacle on my counter, on my cooktop when I'm baking. So like for instance, we're going to unwrap this butter, and the wrappers from the butter we're going to throw in to our trash bin right there. Super easy. How amazing was that? So I use unsalted butter in all of my baking. I've mentioned that before. There are occasions when you can use salted butter, like if you're making buttercream. Some people like to use buttercream icing. Some people like to use salted butter, and then you don't have to add salt to the recipe. It just adds a little bit more flavor to it. But for any baking that I use, I use unsalted butter. If you want to use margarine, use unsalted margarine. So there we go. We got our pound of butter in the pot, and we're going to set that on the stove on high heat just to melt and bring it to a boil. Just be careful it doesn't splash around, because butter has a tendency to pop when it gets really super hot. While that's heating up, while that's heating up, you would measure out your other ingredients. I already have other ingredients here. We're going to melt the butter, bring it to a boil, turn the heat off, and then we're going to add all of our chocolate to that so that it melts. And it kind of makes, I guess you could say it kind of makes like a butter ganache. We're using unsweetened and semi-sweet chocolate for this recipe. The unsweetened obviously gives it that really rich chocolate flavor. The semi-sweet gives it a little bit of sweetness on top of the 2.5 cups of sugar that we're using. And just a nice chocolatey flavor. So I know I've mentioned before, but the unsweetened chocolate that I use is, I buy it at Aldi. It's a super inexpensive brand of chocolate, but it's really good quality. So I'm actually using 85%. I'm not using unsweetened. 85% is a really high percentage, so it is a very, very dark, bittersweet chocolate. 100% obviously is straight unsweetened chocolate. It comes in all different percentages: 72, 55, 33, 85. So I'm using 85%. That's dark enough for this recipe. So this is a really good brand of chocolate to use. This is what I use. And then I'm just using semi-sweet chips because they're super easy. You don't have to chop up a big block of chocolate. You do want to break it up, the whatever chocolate you're using. Either want it to be chips or you want it to be broken up into little pieces. This is so that it melts really evenly and really nicely and easily in the butter. And it doesn't clump and leave big pieces of chocolate because you don't want that. Let me just check and see if we have any comments. Oh, my friend Josh in Florida is watching. Hi, Josh. All right, so no questions yet. If you do have any questions, please, I'm watching lives. I'm getting the questions and comments live, so please interact. So there's our chocolate. We're going to add that to the butter when it's all melted and boiling. In the meantime, we're going to sift all of our dry ingredients. It's good to sift your ingredients to kind of aerate them. And it also gets out any chunks or any big pieces of something that you don't want in there. It lightens up the flour. So I have our flour, our salt, and our baking powder. I use kosher salt. Flour, salt, and baking powder are going in. We're going to sift all those together. If you buy, sometimes you can buy pre-sifted flour. I would still sift it. Pretty much all flour is pre-sifted because in the factory they sift it through a sieve. But then it sits on the shelf and it compacts and gets all unsifted as it sits waiting for you to buy it. So we're using all-purpose flour here. Not cake flour, not pastry flour, not bread flour, obviously not bread flour. Because I use kosher salt, I don't know if you can see in the above camera, the kosher salt has a bigger granule, so I'm just checking to make sure there's no big other things in it, and then I'm going to dump the kosher salt in there. So yeah, there's our dry ingredients are all sifted and ready to go. I'm actually going to put those back in this bowl. I hear the butter bubbling in the back, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it a little stir to make sure that it's all melting evenly. You can see a little steam coming off of it, so that's melting really well. All-purpose flour or cake flour. We're using all-purpose flour for this. You can use cake flour. The all-purpose flour obviously is all-purpose. Cake flour is going to give you a little bit lighter and cakier of a brownie. Might not be as fudgy. But yeah, all-purpose or pastry flour are the best to use for this recipe. Cake flour is more for cakes. Why do you use kosher salt? I use kosher salt because it's a pure salt. So your regular table salt has iodine in it. It's iodized salt. Kosher salt does not have any additives or anything in it because it's used for the koshering process of meat. So it has to be a pure salt. I also like the bigger granules of salt. I think it gives a better flavor. So that is why I use kosher salt. I like the pure salt flavor. So our butter is almost completely melted here. I'm going to go ahead and whisk it up a little bit just to make sure. It is boiling. Yeah, so I'll come over and show you. So it is completely melted, and you can see it's steaming hot, which is exactly what we want. It is boiling a little bit when I put it on the heat. So I'm going to now turn the heat off and then add all of our chocolate all at once to the butter. And then we're going to let it sit for a minute. And we're going to let it sit, and we're going to let it melt. Because the butter is so hot, obviously the chocolate is going to melt pretty smoothly into it, but I like to let it sit just like I do a ganache. I like to let it sit for a minute. Give it a little stir. And then the heat is off. We're just going to let it sit on the warm burner and get all nice and melty. So while we're waiting for that to melt, do you have any questions? Oh, no. While I'm waiting for that to melt, we're going to whisk together our eggs and our sugar. So whenever I am making a recipe, I always like to put the wet ingredients in the bowl first and then the dry on top of them. That way, if you put the dry down first and then the wet on top of it, the dry sometimes will stick to the bottom of the bowl and it won't blend in evenly. So I put the wet ingredients in first so that when the dry sits on top of it, they're not sticking to the bottom of the bowl. Alright, so we're going to crack 6 eggs. These are room temperature eggs. Doesn't really matter. They can be cold at this point because we're not really foaming the eggs. We're not really foaming the eggs for our leavening purposes here. We're using baking powder for leavening, which is also why I'm not using my KitchenAid mixer and it's nice and quiet. because I'm not really worried about whipping up the eggs too much. So to the eggs, we're going to add our sugar. I think we're using 2 1/4 cups of granulated sugar. So add those right in. And then we're also going to add in our coffee powder. So this is instant coffee powder. It's 3 tablespoons. What this does is it adds a really rich chocolatey flavor. Not so much a coffee flavor, but coffee actually enhances the flavor of the chocolate. Since we're doing a dark chocolate kind of recipe here, it just enhances the chocolate flavor. It makes it a more bold chocolatey flavor. So it's not really a coffee brownie. It's just a kind of like an underlying thing. I actually like to use this in like when I'm making devil's food cake as well. I'll add a tablespoon of coffee to it to kind of, again, enhance the flavor. Because one of the flavors of chocolate is coffee, and one of the flavors of coffee can be chocolate when you're tasting the foods. So we're going to go ahead and add that right in there. We're also going to add our vanilla extract, pure vanilla extract, right on in there. And then we're going to whisk all these ingredients together. Again, we're not worried about, could you use instant espresso powder? Absolutely. I wouldn't use 3 tablespoons worth. I would use, I would probably cut it in half. I would probably use 1 1/2 tablespoons if you're using espresso powder, because obviously it's a lot more intense. The coffee is actually, the espresso or the coffee is actually going to mix into and kind of melt into these wet ingredients. If you use espresso powder though, I believe espresso powder is actually espresso beans ground up super fine, whereas the coffee is brewed coffee that's dehydrated. So again, I would just cut it in half if you use espresso powder, if you don't want to use the instant coffee granules. So I'm just whipping it up to get it all together, and that is pretty much it. Joey puts coffee in honey cake. That actually is a really good recipe, so I might have to do that one day on here. Joey's honey cake he makes for Rosh Hashanah is really, really good, so I might have to do that on here. So that's pretty much all we need to do. Don't kill yourself trying to whip this up to maximum volume, because I'm not concerned about that. To this, we're going to add our chocolate. So it's been about 5 minutes, hopefully. We're going to slowly in the center just start to whisk. And you can see in the center it's kind of blending together. Kind of same concept when you're making a ganache. You want to start in the center and kind of get it emulsified in the center, and then work your way out to the edges to get an even mixture here. So again, we have our unsweetened chocolate, semi-sweet chocolate chips, and the butter, and you can see it's melted perfectly smooth. I didn't even have the heat on, just the heat from the melted butter. Get the edges, and there you have it. See how smooth and delicious that is? That probably tastes really, really good. Really intense chocolate flavor. I can smell it. So we're going to add this to the eggs all at once. Make sure you scrape the bowl out, or scrape the pot. Once you add the chocolate to the butter, do not turn your heat back on, because you will scorch the bottom of the pot and burn the chocolate, and then you'll have to start all over again. There are a few, I don't know if you could see them, there were a few little, what looked like unmelted chocolate kind of caught in the crevice in the corner of the pot. It's not unmelted, it just wasn't whisked in, because the whisk didn't get all the way into the corner of the pot. So there we have all of our chocolate in there. We're going to whisk that together. You don't really have to temper the mix. I wasn't too worried about it curdling. Since we added the chocolate to the hot butter, it kind of cooled the butter down, so it's not super intensely hot. You would want to temper in the chocolate if you were, like if you're making a creme anglaise, vanilla sauce, or pastry cream, you temper your hot ingredient into the egg mixture so that you don't scramble the eggs. But this is barely hot, so I don't have to worry about tempering for that. I'm going to switch to a spoon at this point, because once we add the flour and the dry ingredients, it's going to be a little bit easier. And I'll probably use the spatula again too. So to this, we're going to add our sifted dry ingredients. And we're going to get those mixed in really well, making sure we scrape the bowl along as we go. We're not worried about folding because we didn't really whip up those eggs too much. And we have the baking powder as our leavening agent. So you're kind of just mixing this in until it's fully combined. If it's a little lumpy, it's not a big deal either. I know when you make brownie mix out of a box, it says, I think you mix it for 2.5 minutes, and it's not a big deal if it's lumpy because it does look lumpy when you're making it from a box. But those lumps somehow magically bake out. Alright, so our dry ingredients are in. We're going to add in our chocolate and our nuts. We have 12 ounces of semi-sweet chocolate chips and 3 cups of walnuts. I'm using walnuts bits and pieces. I'm not using chopped walnuts. I kind of like the whole or the bigger chunks of walnut in it. If you want to use chopped walnuts, gegazent, use your chopped walnuts. Pecans, I would recommend using chopped pecans. Large pecans can get a little too much in one bite. We're going to add all those dry ingredients in. And then we're going to mix them in. It's looking amazing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is our brownie mix. That's it. You made it. We survived. So now I'm going to get our pan together for it. This recipe uses a half sheet size pan. The end. That's pretty much all I got about that. So we're using a half sheet size pan, and we are using our wonderful pan for baking. I like that you don't need a mix master. Yes, you don't need to use a KitchenAid or Mixmaster or hand mixer for this. You can do it all by hand. It's a lot quieter. I know my producer liked that I wasn't using the mixer today. Pan for baking. I preach this probably every show. Is amazing. Nothing will stick when you use pan for baking. It's got the flour already mixed in, so you don't have to butter and flour your pan. It's all already there. So we're just going to do an even coat of that. We're going to make sure we get the edges pretty well. And that's it. I guarantee you, I'll show you, that these will not stick to this pan. Could you use a 9x13? Would they be too thick? They would be thicker, and they will probably have to bake longer if you use a 9x13. The batter is a little bit much for a 9x13. So they'll just be a thicker brownie, and they'll probably have to bake a little bit longer. Excuse me. How about parchment paper? You don't really need to use parchment paper when I use pan for baking. If you're just using regular spray or butter, I would line the bottom with parchment paper. The side, not so much, because you can always run around those with a knife. But I would definitely put a layer in the bottom of parchment just to be safe. Excuse me. All right. So we're going to go ahead. Our oven has been preheated to 350 degrees. We're going to go ahead and pour the batter in. And then we're just going to spread it out to the edge of the pan here. And that's it. These are ready to go. So we're going to put these in the 350 degree oven. They're going to bake for about 35 minutes. One important thing about these brownies is you don't want to overbake them because you want these to be a really fudgy brownie. So if you're doing this recipe in a half sheet pan size, 35 minutes is the baking time. You can put a wooden skewer in or a toothpick in to make sure that they're not battery. But pretty much 35 minutes is what you want to do so that they are so that they're nice and fudgy. So we're going to go ahead and put these in. And then, through the magic of television, we have our brownies. This is what they will look like when they're done, God willing. So yeah, these are the brownies, finished brownies. They look amazing. I'm going to show you how to take them out of the pan and cut them really easily. What you do need is you need a second pan. We're going to set that right on top. Grab hold of it. Give it a flip. A little tap. Say a little prayer. Voila. Told you they would not stick. This pan for baking, buy stock in it because it is amazing. Clean pan, easy to clean out. No, not a problem. And then we're going to slide these right onto our cutting board. 1, 2, 3. So this might seem like a lot of work. It might be a little too much for some people. You are more than welcome to order these brownies from me, Bryan's Bakery. And I will do all the work for you. I can ship them to you. I can deliver them to you. You can pick them up from me. I can do it with chocolate. I can do it with walnuts. We can do chocolate chips. You can. I was talking about customization. Throw some marshmallows in there. They become Rocky Road brownies. Put some cheesecake batter in them. They become cream cheese or cheesecake brownies. Brownies are super versatile. You can use butterscotch chips. You can use M&Ms. You can use your favorite candy. Heath bars, crunched up Heath bars is really good in them. So yeah, brownies are just a super versatile thing. So we're gonna get 20 brownies out of this, hopefully. We're gonna do, I think we're gonna do 4 by 5. So we might do 4 by 6 just so I can do it evenly. So we're gonna cut it in half first. I don't know what that was. We're going to cut each half in half, so that way we end up with 4. We're going to cut each half in half again. That way we end up with 8. I'm sorry, this is 32. Look at me. I swear I did pass kindergarten. So if you wanted to cut them smaller, you can do this way. You can do 8 by 4 is 32, so you can do them a little bit smaller. If you wanted to get a little bit larger of a brownie, we then cut it into thirds. And you'll get a little bit larger of a brownie. That way you'd get 24. So then, you just turn it, and you go in half, and then in half, and then in half, and you have yourself your cut brownies. And then what you do, now we're going to get crazy. Find yourself a plate. You find yourself some of that leftover ganache that you have in the back of the fridge. Well, I'll just talk about it because I don't have my microwave set up right now. So we're going to take one of these brownies. I like the center brownies. I don't like the edge brownies. So we're going to leave the edge brownie for someone else. Take one of these beautiful center brownies. And then you take your ice cream scoop. And if you're bougie like me, I made some cherry vanilla ice cream last night in my ice cream maker. So you take a scoop of homemade ice cream. Get a nice big scoop out of there. And you plop that right down on top of your nice warm brownie. And then, if you do have some ganache melted, drizzle your ganache on top of it. Have yourself a little brownie sundae. Amazing. Put a little whipped cream and a cherry. Set to go. I will post the recipe for the vanilla ice cream if anybody has an ice cream maker at home. I'll post that later this afternoon so you can make your own brownie sundae. The ganache recipe is already posted from, I believe, a Passover thing. I can link them all into one so you can have the whole recipe for yourself. But there you have it. Homemade brownie sundae, chocolate fudge brownies, or walnut brownies, or Rocky Road brownies, or M&M brownies, however you like it. This brownie base recipe is really, really good. Really versatile, simple to make, as you can see. and it comes out with a really good brownie. So, with that being said, I'm going to taste some. Oh my god. So good. Such a rich chocolatey flavor. You do get a little hint of the coffee, but it just enhances the richness of the chocolate. They're they're moist. They're delicious. The chunks of chocolate chip in them. Just a really, really good brownie recipe. I hope you learned something with me today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Next week we're going to be doing the sister to brownies. We're going to be doing blondies next week, pecan butterscotch blondie. So I hope you tune in to join us for that. If you're making these at home, enjoy them. If you've made them and you're eating them now, I hope you're enjoying them. In the immortal words of the original TV chef Julia Child, bon appetit.